Jackson's army was gone. They were pushing hard for New York City.
Tell the Philadelphia ladies that the heavenly, sweet, pretty redcoats, the accomplished gentlemen of the Guards and Grenadiers, have humbled themselves on the plains of Monmouth. General Anthony Wayne.
For General Washington, this was a great public relations coup. He had sent his despised second-in-command forward to attack the British, and Lee had been forced to retreat. He had delivered an exhausted enemy to Washington's footsteps. Washington had then pushed the British back, so Washington gained the glory of the Battle of Monmouth. Lee was in disgrace, was forced out of the army, and it got rid of dissension in the American army and made it a much more cohesive unit.
Monmouth, considered a draw by most historians, was the last major engagement of the Revolutionary War to be fought in the North. Now the British would concentrate their efforts on the southern colonies and on fighting a contest for global supremacy with France.
The Americans were fighting in this war for two very clear goals. From the outset, they had in mind independence, and they had in mind expansion to the whole North American continent. They didn't have a vision of a future with just 13 colonies in a very narrow strip along the Atlantic seaboard. They had in mind Canada, the 13 colonies as we know them, Florida, and all of that part of America reaching out to the Mississippi.
Beyond the Appalachian Mountains lay a forest-cloaked land of almost unimaginable size and richness. Some of the most brutal fighting of the Revolutionary War took place there, over control of that land. The combatants weren't armies lined up in tight military formations, but guerrilla bands of Indians and settlers who struck with unbridled ferocity and then moved on.
I use the term savage not to attribute it to Native Americans, but to talk more about unrestricted warfare, warfare that involved children, it involved women, it involved non-combatants of all sorts. Many times backcountry Americans who we want to hold to some sort of ideal were perpetuating brutal murders and brutal activity against Native people that we've traditionally attributed to Indians. But it was going both ways.
This portrait presents George Rogers Clark as a middle-aged and balding man. But in 1777, he was a 24-year-old, red-haired, raw-boned frontier colossus who had a plan that could secure for the newly independent League of States the area north of the Ohio River, including the choice Illinois country. Late in 1777, as Washington engaged Howe near Philadelphia, and Arnold and Gates met Burgoyne near Saratoga, Clark ventured to civilized Williamsburg, where his plan met with the approval of Virginia's governor, Patrick Henry.
Clark's plan, with the backing of Virginia money from Governor Patrick Henry, is to recruit a party of soldiers in the backcountry along the Ohio River, western Pennsylvania, down into Kentucky, float and march them overland and seize the British posts in the Illinois country, which is really the plum of the Trans-Appalachian West. It's where most of the population is at this point.
On the 4th of July, 1778, he took the first British fort, Kaskaskia, without firing a shot. The French townspeople were bewildered. Americans had been their enemies in the French and Indian War. Now that France had entered the War of Independence, Clark brought them the news that they were now allies.
Nothing could excel the confusion these people seemed to be in. Being taught to expect nothing but savage treatment from the Americans, given all for lost, they were willing to be slaves to save their families. George Rogers Clark.
Cahokia fell, followed by the town of Vincennes and its Fort Sackville. Then Clark set to the task of pacifying thousands of Indian chiefs and warriors.
Clark is a consummate Indian hater. but at the same time is very effective at negotiating with the native people that he comes in contact with in the Ohio country. He sort of adopts the role of the warrior rather than the diplomat, and he kind of blusters about how strong he is and about how his men are warriors, and talks to them as a fellow warrior as opposed to a peacemaker.
But while Clark negotiated with the Indians, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hamilton swept down from his fort in Detroit with 500 Indians, British troops, and loyalists. Hamilton was known as the hair buyer because of the hundreds of scalps he had purchased from Indian war parties. Without firing a shot, he recaptured Vincennes and its Fort Sackville. His actions prompted Clark to undertake a legendary winter journey. He and his men would cross flooded prairies and lowlands to surprise Hamilton at Vincennes.
They could not suppose we should be so mad as to attempt to march 80 leagues through a drowned country in the depth of winter. They would be off their guard and probably would not think it worthwhile to keep out spies. George Rogers Clark.
When Clark is marching his men to Vincennes, he conducts these men, in a sense, like a war party. He gives war feasts so that different companies will go out and hunt deer and give feasts for one another. They have war dances. And when their spirits seem to be flagging, paints his face black and leaps into the river with a war whoop to try and motivate his men.
Clark pushed his men hard through chest-deep icy water to reach Vincennes. Even as the grueling journey weakened Clark's men physically, it strengthened them spiritually. He noted that they began to feel superior to other men. On February 23rd, they arrived at their destination. Clark decided not to wait. He sent a letter to the French townspeople of Vincennes, telling them to stay indoors. He planned to take the fort that night. Wet, tired frontiersmen with rifles faced a fort armed with cannon.
One of the ways they're able to keep the garrison down and from really making a very effective defense is by firing through the loopholes and cannon ports of the fort, which keeps the British soldiers from manning the cannons and firing against them.
Smart firing all night on both sides. The cannon played smartly. Not one of our men wounded. Fine sport for the Sons of Liberty. Captain James Bowman.
By the next day, the British surrender was inevitable, and Clark's men captured a group of Hamilton's Indians. This is how the hair buyer himself reported Clark's next actions.
One of them was tomahawked immediately. The rest, sitting on the ground in a ring, bound, seeing by the fate of their comrade what they had to expect. The next on his left sung his death song, and was in turn tomahawked. The chief of this party, after having the hatchet stuck in his head, took it out himself and delivered it to the inhuman monster who struck him first, who repeated his stroke a second and a third time, after which the miserable spectacle was dragged by the rope around his neck to the river, thrown in, and suffered to spend still a few moments of life in fruitless strugglings. Colonel Clark, yet reeking with the blood of these unhappy victims, came to the esplanade before the fort gate, where I had agreed to meet him and treat of the surrender of the garrison. He spoke with rapture of his late achievement, while he washed the blood from his hand stained in this inhuman sacrifice. Henry Hamilton.
With Hamilton's surrender, Clark ensured complete control of the Illinois country by the newly United States for the rest of the war.